The trembling hands didn't belong to someone who was afraid. They belonged to someone who was furious and had learned, a long time ago, that rage was only useful when it stayed quiet. Natalie Hayes sorted cardiac charts in the fluorescent glare of Oak Creek Memorial's ICU station on her third day, her fingers moving through post-operative records with the methodical precision of a woman who had done this exact work in field hospitals where the power went out mid-surgery and you had to keep a dying soldier's chest open by the light of a phone flashlight. The antiseptic smell hung thick in the air, mixing with something else, stale coffee and fear, the particular fear that only hospitals carried. She wasn't supposed to be noticing the billing discrepancies. A new nurse on the cardiac floor kept her head down, smiled when addressed, spoke in soft, careful sentences designed to make her invisible. That was the job when you were the third new hire in 18 months and the last two had quit before their probationary period ended. But Natalie Hayes had spent 12 years reading details that other people missed, and right now, sitting at the station at 11:06 p.m. with the night shift skeleton crew 3 rooms away, she was staring at post-operative charges for Admiral James Westbrook that didn't match what the charts actually documented. Room for 47 contained a 73-year-old Navy admiral whose heart was failing despite 5 different specialists rotating through with their expensive suits and their confidence. Cardiology had pumped him full of medications. Interventional radiology had tried a catheter intervention. Electrophysiology had examined his rhythm disturbances. Cardiac surgery had hemmed and hawed about whether they could actually help. And somehow, in the middle of all that care from all those doctors, the post-operative charges had climbed to $47,000 for procedures that never happened. Natalie's hands trembled, not with fear, but with the specific rage of someone who had seen what corruption looked like when it wore a white coat. She made a quiet note in her pocket-sized spiral notebook, the kind she'd carried through Helmand Province, and slipped the Admiral's original billing folder back into the rack. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like something dying slowly. She would keep her head down. She would do her job. She would wait. That's when the shoes arrived. Dr. Marcus Hargrove's leather Oxford shoes clicked against the linoleum with the sound of a man who had never once doubted his place in a room. He was tall, early 50s, the kind of handsome that came from a lifetime of never being told no, a jaw like cut glass, silver at the temples, the confidence of someone whose family name opened doors at country clubs. He wore a tie even though it was nearly midnight, because men like Hargrove wore ties to bed. He surveyed the cardiac ICU with the expression of someone taking inventory of his property, and then his eyes landed on her. She felt it the way animals feel the shift in air pressure before a storm. His smile was present. Predatory. Interested. You're the new nurse. He didn't ask it as a question. From where? San Diego, originally. It was true. That's where the cover story started. I was looking for a smaller hospital setting. How long are you staying? She looked at him without flinching. As long as I'm needed. He smiled wider. Something in that smile suggested he already knew the answer to a question he hadn't asked yet. He looked at the charts in her lap, the Admiral's records, and his expression didn't change. But something shifted behind his eyes. A calculation. A recalibration. Well, welcome to Oak Creek, he said. You'll fit right in. He moved on, his footsteps clicking away toward the medication room, and Natalie's hands stopped trembling. The rage had settled into something colder. More useful. She'd seen that look before, in Helmand, when a Taliban recruiter had realized she wasn't what she appeared to be. That momentary pause. That flash of recognition that something wasn't adding up. He knew. Not how much she knew, but that she knew something. The next morning, Natalie arrived for her shift at 6:45 a.m. She hung her jacket in her locker, the one with the faded unit patch sewn into the lining where no one would ever see it, where she could feel it against her ribs every shift like an anchor to a life that was officially erased, and pulled on her scrubs. Navy blue. The color felt ironic. She pushed the thought away. The nurse's station erupted the moment she walked into the ICU. Dr. Hargrove stood surrounded by 5 other staff members, 2 nurses, an intern, a resident, and the unit coordinator. He was speaking in that voice that wasn't quite loud enough to be heard from a distance, but carried perfectly to everyone nearby. His tie today was Hermes silk, the color of expensive wine. "I'll give her 1 week," he announced, not looking at her but somehow ensuring his words landed exactly in her hearing range. "Maybe 6 days if we're optimistic. The last 3 lasted until their first encounter with my floor. This one has the look of someone who doesn't have the temperament for cardiac nursing." He smiled at the assembled group. "Anyone want to take the bet? I have $100 that says she quits before Friday." The intern laughed nervously. The unit coordinator looked away. One of the nurses, a woman named Martinez who'd been kind to her, actually blushed. Natalie kept walking. She moved past them without change in pace, without change in breathing, without a single muscle in her face acknowledging that she'd heard. She had perfected this in a place where the wrong reaction to a threat could get you killed. Here, it was merely a matter of dignity. She clocked in, checked her patient assignments, and reviewed the morning medication list for the Admiral in room for 47. His vitals had declined overnight. O2 saturation had dipped to 88%. His heart rate was climbing toward the low 120s. The left-sided chest pain that he'd been complaining about was getting worse. She made a note and said nothing. By noon, the cafeteria incident occurred with the kind of mathematical precision that suggested it had been planned. Natalie was carrying her lunch tray, salad, coffee in a paper cup, a sandwich, when an intern named Davidson approached from the opposite direction. He wasn't looking where he was going. His trajectory was going to take him directly into her, and she adjusted her path to avoid him. He adjusted again, staying in her path. It was the kind of choreography that happened when someone wanted a collision but needed it to look accidental. He hit her tray from underneath. Food scattered. The salad container spun across the tile floor, lettuce and dressing creating a 2-meter spray pattern. The coffee cup followed, its lid popping off and sending brown liquid across her scrubs and down onto the cafeteria's white tile. The sandwich landed on its corner, then slid. She watched it all happen with the detached clarity of someone who'd learned to observe violence rather than react to it. The cafeteria went quiet. She could hear the industrial refrigerator humming. She could hear someone's phone buzzing. She could hear the fluorescent lights doing their slow electrical hum like insects dying on a summer evening. Davidson straightened up immediately, concern spreading across his face that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I didn't see." "It's fine," she said quietly. "I'll get it." She crouched down, started gathering pieces of salad. Her scrubs were soaked. The dressing had gotten into her hair, a thin strand sticking to her left shoulder. She could feel 30 pairs of eyes on her back. She could feel the weight of their attention like pressure. That's when the chart landed. It came from her blind spot, from behind and above, and hit the floor beside her with the force of something thrown rather than dropped. The manila folder scattered pages everywhere. She recognized it immediately, the Admiral's chart, the one with the billing discrepancies, the one that shouldn't have been out of the medication room. "Pick that up, sweetheart." Dr. Hargrove's voice had the velvet quality of absolute certainty that he was untouchable. "You seem to be good at cleaning up messes." She felt it then. Just for a moment. Just for the fraction of a second where her nervous system registered the indignity of it, the cruelty so precisely calibrated to break someone, the public humiliation designed to make her crack. Her hands trembled. But the trembling wasn't fear. It was the razor-thin membrane between rage and restraint, the thing that had kept her alive for 12 years in places where one mistake got people killed. She took one measured breath. She felt a single tear escape as she bent to retrieve the scattered papers, the pages of the Admiral's chart mixing with the pieces of her lunch. The tear wasn't sadness. It was the precise amount of emotion that made her look fragile rather than dangerous. It was calculation. She gathered the papers. She stood up. She looked Dr. Hargrove directly in the eye. "I've cleaned up bigger messes than this, Doctor." Her voice was quiet. It didn't shake. It didn't waver. It was steady in a way that suggested it had been tempered in fire, that it had given orders in languages he couldn't speak, that it had held the lives of soldiers in its hands. The cafeteria stayed silent. No one breathed. No one moved. For just a moment, something in Hargrove's expression flickered. A recalibration. A sudden awareness that he might have just made a tactical error. Then he smiled again, but it was a different smile, uncertain, testing, the smile of a predator that had just realized the prey might have teeth. He turned and walked away. Natalie stood alone in the middle of the cafeteria, holding the Admiral's chart and the scattered pages of his billing records, her scrub soaked with coffee and dressing, a strand of salad stuck in her hair, and not a single person looking directly at her. She gathered the remaining pages methodically. She stepped over the spilled food. She walked back to the ICU with her head level and her hands steady. In room for 47, the Admiral slept, his heart monitor tracing its struggling rhythm across the screen. She checked his oxygen saturation, 86% now and dropping, and made notes. His breathing was shallow. His lips were pale. His body was running out of time, and the 5 specialists rotating through his care seemed content to let it happen with their medications and their caution and their reluctance to do anything that might carry risk. She sat down at the nurse's station and opened her notebook. She wrote down everything she'd seen in the billing records. She wrote down the dates, the amounts, the procedures that hadn't occurred. She wrote down the Admiral's deteriorating condition and the fact that none of the 5 doctors seemed willing to try anything that might actually help. She wrote down that she hadn't come to Oak Creek Memorial to stay invisible. She'd come because her son served under an Admiral, and now that Admiral was dying in a hospital where the person with the power to save him was busy stealing from the government and trying to destroy anyone who noticed. Natalie Hayes had survived 12 years in Helmand Province wearing a face that nobody could read. She could survive one doctor's cruelty for as long as it took. And when the time came, when the Admiral's heart finally gave up its last beat and no one was willing to do what needed to be done, she would be the only one left standing, the only one capable of saving a life that 5 doctors were content to let slip away. The evening shift at Oak Creek Memorial moved with that peculiar rhythm that happens after sunset, slower, heavier, like the hospital itself was breathing more deliberately. Natalie pushed the medication cart down the cardiac ward corridor at 8:51 p.m., her shoes making that soft rubber sound against polished tile that she'd learned to predict before she landed it. Room for 47 was her last stop before the night nurse took over, and something about that room had been pulling at her attention all shift long. The Admiral lay against his pillows like a man running out of time, though he wouldn't know it yet. His breathing had changed. Natalie noticed things other nurses missed because she'd learned to read the language that bodies speak when they're starting to fail, shallow, hurried, the kind of breathing that comes from panic at a level the brain hasn't quite processed. His neck looked different too. The veins were distended, standing out like rope beneath his skin, and when she listened to his heart through her stethoscope, the sounds came back muffled. Distant. As if something was pressing down on his heart from the outside, suffocating it. She'd heard those sounds before. Not in a hospital. In a mud compound outside Sanjin in Helmand Province while artillery fire shook the walls and she knelt over a young operator whose chest had collapsed inward. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid accumulating in the pericardial sac, compressing the heart, crushing it slowly from the outside while the man lay awake and terrified and unable to understand why his own body was turning against him. Natalie pressed the call button for the physician on duty and waited, her composure settling around her like a familiar coat. The Admiral's eyes found hers, and she saw the question there, the fear that hadn't quite become panic but was absolutely on its way. She said nothing. Just stood there with one hand on the bed rail, present, steady, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse than this. The monitors began their shrieking at 9:03 p.m. The sound cut through the ward like a blade, that high-pitched wail that means the system is failing, that numbers are dropping, that the patient's body is staging a rebellion it cannot win. The blood pressure alarm screamed first. 118/76, then 110/72, then the numbers falling like a stone dropped down a well. Natalie was moving before the second alarm activated, her body responding to circuits laid down over 13 years of service and 4 tours that had taught her what death sounds like when it's arriving on a timeline. She entered room for 47 to find the Admiral gasping, his chest heaving, his body's desperate attempt to pull oxygen from air that his failing heart could no longer distribute. His skin had taken on that ashen pallor, the color of someone whose body is redirecting blood away from the periphery, sacrificing the extremities to keep the core alive a few minutes longer. His jugular veins bulged like they might burst through the paper-thin skin of his neck. His heart sounds were barely audible now, as if his heart was beating inside a soundproof chamber. Pericardial tamponade. The diagnosis was certain. The solution was simpler than the disease, but it required moving fast. It required someone to take a needle and insert it into the space between the heart and the tissue surrounding it, to draw off the fluid that was suffocating him, to do it in the next 20 minutes or watch him die. She called the code overhead, her voice steady and clear. "We need all cardiologists to room for 47. Possible cardiac tamponade. Now." They came fast. Hargrove arrived first, followed by Chen and Rodriguez, then Pembroke and Khalil. 5 doctors in white coats, all moving with that sense of urgency that major hospitals train into their staff. 5 men whose job it was to make the decision that kept people alive. Natalie briefed them with the efficiency of someone who had done this in conditions far worse than fluorescent lighting and climate control. Distended neck veins. Muffled heart sounds. Blood pressure dropping. Respiratory distress. He needs pericardiocentesis immediately. The fluid is compressing his cardiac output. Hargrove's jaw tightened. She saw him process her competence and dismiss it in the same moment, the way he always did when she spoke with certainty about things he'd learned in textbooks instead of in rooms where people died when you hesitated. "We wait for the cardiac surgeon," Hargrove said. His voice had that particular quality of authority that comes from never having been questioned, the kind of certainty that builds when you're accustomed to being right because no one brave enough contradicts you. She checked her watch. Dr. Morrison was 2 hours away. Maybe closer. Maybe stuck in Atlanta traffic. Definitely not here. "He'll be dead in 30 minutes, Natalie said. Not a question. Not a suggestion. A statement of medical fact, delivered with the same tone she might use to say the sun would rise in the morning. Chen shook his head slowly, a gesture she'd seen before in hospitals and in combat zones, the gesture of someone who had decided that procedure and caution mattered more than speed. "Liability," he said quietly. "If the needle perforates the myocardium. If we wait, his heart stops," Natalie said. "That's not liability. That's negligence." Rodriguez stepped back, his arms crossing over his chest in that universal gesture of retreat. "The patient's too unstable for an emergency procedure. His vitals won't tolerate anesthesia. He doesn't need anesthesia. He's already sedated. He's in shock." Pembroke looked away, out the window where Savannah was glittering with rain beginning to fall, fat drops that hammered against the glass like something demanding entry. "We need consensus. We need to call." "There's no time to call anyone," Natalie said. She could hear her voice changing, the careful deference draining out like water from a tank with a crack in it. "Look at him." The Admiral's eyes had started to roll back. His breathing had become desperate, primitive, the kind of breathing that comes when the brain is being starved of oxygen. His blood pressure was now 78/52. The monitor showed a heart rate of 142, tachycardic and erratic, his body throwing everything at the problem and having nothing left in the tank. Khalil deferred to Hargrove with a slight nod, the kind of gesture that meant the younger doctor had already surrendered to hierarchy. Hargrove took a breath, and Natalie watched his decision crystallize in his face. This was where she became a threat. Not because she was wrong, but because she was right, and because being right without credentials was the one kind of competence that powerful men could not tolerate. "Stand down, Hayes," Hargrove said. Not a request. It wasn't the tone he used with nurses. It was the tone he used with people he was about to destroy. "We stabilize with fluids and wait for the surgeon." That's the protocol. The protocol is to save the patient, Natalie said. The protocol is to follow the chain of command, Hargrove said. And you are not in the chain of command. You're a nurse. You follow orders. And my order is that you step back and let us handle this. She watched him turn away, watched Chen and Rodriguez and Pembroke and Khalil arrange themselves around the bed with the resigned efficiency of men who had decided that caution was a kind of courage. One of them reached for the foreline to push fluids. The fluid would make things worse, would fill the pericardial sac even faster, would give the Admiral perhaps 5 extra minutes of conscious deterioration before his heart simply stopped. 5 doctors. All refusing. All united by protocol and liability and the unspoken agreement that existed in hospitals everywhere, that procedure mattered more than the patient, that the system mattered more than the outcome, that an Admiral's life was worth less than the risk of being sued. Natalie stepped back. She had been trained to follow orders. 13 years in the Navy teaches you that chains of command exist for reasons that your individual judgment cannot overrule. She'd learned that lesson in Helmand Province, where she'd argued with a commander about sending a patrol to a location she knew was compromised, and the commander had overruled her, and 4 men had come back in bags. She'd stepped back then too. The monitors continued their screaming. The alarm sounds cut through the ward like a siren at 3 a.m., the kind of noise that makes other patients press their call buttons and ask nurses what that sound means. Nobody answered them. Nobody was listening to anything except the sound of a Navy admiral's body beginning its final surrender, and the quiet certainty of 5 doctors who believed that waiting was a form of wisdom. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the moment when Natalie saw the Admiral's chart clearly in the light, and her eyes caught on a detail in his service record. Current command assignment. Unit designation. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. The exact unit where her son served. The exact unit whose deployment orders had been signed by this man's command authority. This Admiral had sent her boy into harm's way. This Admiral had made decisions about other people's children with the same casual certainty he was using now to refuse treatment that could save his own life. The irony was suffocating. The rage that rose in her was the kind that doesn't come with trembling or heat or any of the physical manifestations that people associate with anger. The rage that comes from realizing the systems you've served your entire life are designed to fail you exactly when you're needed most. The rage of someone who watched good people die because they followed orders instead of trusting their instincts. The rage of someone who'd spent for years burying her name and her identity so the Pentagon could keep its secrets, and now had to watch those same institutions fail in real time, in front of her, while she stood powerless in a nurse's uniform. The Admiral's blood pressure was now 71/48. His breathing had become labored, irregular. His fingers were going grey. His eyes had stopped moving. He was conscious enough to know something was wrong, not conscious enough to understand what, and not strong enough anymore to fight it. Natalie stood at the foot of the bed and watched 5 doctors do nothing while a man died by inches in front of them. And she realized, with the kind of clarity that comes from having lived in the spaces between impossible choices, that sometimes the only loyalty that matters is the one you owe to the person in front of you, or not to uniforms, not to protocols, not to the systems that built you. She was still deciding what that meant when the Admiral's oxygen saturation began its final descent. The monitors screamed first. Natalie heard them from the medication room where she'd retreated after Hargrove's final dismissal, a sound that cut through the fluorescent hum like a scalpel through silk. Blood pressure alarm. Oxygen saturation alarm. The synchronized beeping that meant only one thing: the Admiral was crashing. She didn't run. Running would draw attention, would trigger protocol, would get her reassigned further from the unit. Instead, she walked. Her pace was measured, her face neutral, the kind of composure that came from having already made a choice the moment she understood what was happening. Room for 47 was a hurricane of white coats when she reached the doorway. 5 physicians stood clustered around the bed, their voices layered in argument like competing radio frequencies nobody could tune out. Dr. Hargrove. Dr. Chen. Dr. Rodriguez. Dr. Pembroke. Dr. Khalil. 5 men who had taken an oath to do no harm and had somehow redefined harm to mean taking action without consensus. The Admiral lay beneath them, his breathing shallow, his chest rising and falling like a creature drowning in air. His blood pressure had tanked to 60/40 and was still falling, a number that meant his heart was working on fumes, on the last reserves of a muscle that had already been starved by whatever was compressing it from within. "We wait for cardiothoracic surgery," Pembroke was saying, his voice carrying the kind of absolute certainty that only came from never having to live with the consequences of being wrong. "The surgeon is 90 minutes out. We move before he arrives, we assume liability if something goes sideways." Something already went sideways, Chen shot back, gesturing at the monitor where the oxygen saturation had dropped to 78% and the rhythm was deteriorating into something that looked like it couldn't sustain consciousness much longer. "Look at the JVD. Look at the pulsus paradoxus. This is textbook tamponade. The fluid is compressing his heart. He needs decompression now or he codes." "The protocol is clear," Rodriguez said, his tone the verbal equivalent of a locked door. "Pericardiocentesis is a cardiologist's procedure. We don't have one on call." Hargrove hadn't spoken yet. He stood at the foot of the bed, watching the Admiral deteriorate the way a man watches a document burn. Natalie recognized the calculation happening behind his eyes, the same calculation that had landed 5 physicians in this room willing to let a man die rather than risk their careers. If the Admiral coded and couldn't be resuscitated, there would be no one asking questions about billing irregularities. There would be no one reviewing charts with the kind of competence required to notice the pattern she'd already seen. There would be no one ordering the kind of detailed investigation that would uncover $60,000 in fraudulent charges for post-operative care that had never happened, kickbacks from a medical supply company that had no legitimate reason to be paying the hospital's chief cardiologist. The Admiral's oxygen saturation dropped to 72%. "Step back, all of you," Natalie said from the doorway, her voice carrying the kind of authority that turned every head in the room. It wasn't a request. It wasn't phrased as a question. It was the voice of someone accustomed to people moving when she spoke. "Nurse Hayes," Hargrove said, his teeth bared in something that wasn't quite a smile, "I believe I gave you clear instructions about your assignments this evening. You are reassigned to the 4th floor. You are not to approach this patient. You are not to touch the crash cart. Those instructions remain in effect." She didn't acknowledge him. She was already moving toward the equipment wall where the pericardiocentesis kit sat in its sealed package, designed for exactly this emergency, gathering dust because 5 physicians had decided that liability was more important than a pulse. Her hands moved with the kind of economy that came from having performed the same procedure under fire in Helmand Province, where the sound of incoming mortar rounds meant you worked faster or watched someone die on the stretcher in front of you. "Absolutely not," Pembroke said, stepping directly into her path. His body language was the language of institutional authority, the kind that worked fine until it met someone who'd lived in spaces where authority meant staying alive. "You do not have the training. You do not have the credentials. You certainly do not have the legal authority to perform an invasive procedure." Natalie sidestepped him without breaking stride. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't dramatic. She simply moved like water around a stone, and by the time he'd processed that she'd passed him, she was already at the bedside pulling the needle kit from its packaging. "Security," Hargrove was saying into his phone, his voice rising. "I need security to room for 47 immediately. We have a staff member attempting to perform an unauthorized procedure." "The cardiac surgeon is still 90 minutes out," Chen said, checking his watch like time was a variable that could be negotiated. "We're waiting for." "He won't survive 90 minutes, Natalie said. Her voice had changed without her planning it, had shifted into a register that made every physician in the room, even the ones trying to stop her, register that they were listening to someone who wasn't asking permission. "Tamponade at this stage. Systolic dropping. Oxygen saturation in the low 70s. You've got maybe 10 minutes before he arrests. After that, CPR on a compressed heart is just pumping blood that has nowhere to go." She was already prepping the site, her hand steady as a surgical laser as she identified the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line, that precise anatomical landmark where the needle would enter without destroying the lungs or the internal mammary artery. The antiseptic smell rose sharp and clean as she swabbed the skin, that particular chemical odor that meant sterile fields and professional spaces. Rodriguez was reaching for her arm, his fingers closing around fabric, but she was already moving, already angling the needle with the kind of precision that came from having done this on living patients in the worst possible conditions. "You are finished," Hargrove hissed, his voice carrying a threat that had nothing to do with what was happening at the bedside and everything to do with what would happen after. "You understand me? Your career at this hospital is finished. I'm calling the board. I'm calling licensing. I'm calling every reference you'll ever need if you attempt to work in medicine again." The needle advanced slowly, finding the path between the ribs, entering the pericardial sac with the kind of certainty that only came from muscle memory that transcended fear. Dark fluid, the fluid that had been slowly crushing the Admiral's heart, compressing it like a hand closing around a grape, filled the syringe. Not red. Not the color of blood. The murky brown-black color of effusion, of fluid that had accumulated faster than the body could absorb it, of something that had been quietly suffocating a man while 5 physicians debated protocols. The monitor changed. That was the thing no one ever mentioned in textbooks, how immediate the response was. How fast the body could remind you that it wanted to live. Blood pressure climbed. 70/45. 85/50. The oxygen saturation crept upward, 78, 82, 86. The rhythm stabilized into something that looked like the electrical pattern of a heart that had just been given permission to work again. Muscle memory had taken over completely. Her hands moved with the kind of automatic precision that belonged to someone who had done this under mortar fire, had done this with worse equipment, had done this on soldiers bleeding out in the back of a Black Hawk flying low and fast across desert territory nobody was supposed to talk about. She withdrew the needle. 800 milliliters of fluid in the syringe. 800 milliliters that had been compressing the Admiral's heart with the patience of a python, patient and inevitable until someone with the right knowledge had the audacity to interfere. The room was so quiet you could hear the rain beginning to fall against the windows outside, the sound of water on glass like thousands of fingers tapping a rhythm that might have been applause or might have been judgment. Natalie didn't know which. "You're finished," Hargrove whispered, and this time the threat wasn't about the hospital or licensing or references. This time it was the whisper of a man whose calculation had gone catastrophically wrong, whose insurance against investigation had just been removed from the monitor, whose entire strategy of controlled incompetence had been dismantled by a nurse with steady hands and the kind of background he couldn't have imagined. By 6 a.m., the monitors showed something close to normal. Blood pressure 110/70. Heart rate 88. Oxygen saturation 97% on room air. The Admiral was sleeping the kind of sleep that meant consciousness had decided it was safe to return, that his body was no longer engaged in the desperate business of simple survival. Natalie stood outside the room, reading the chart that documented her crime in neat physician handwriting, the time of the procedure, the amount of fluid withdrawn, the immediate stabilization, all of it recorded in language that meant only one thing to anyone with the ability to read between the lines. She was still there when Hargrove emerged from the hospital pharmacy at 6:13 a.m., his phone already pressed to his ear, already calling in favors, already setting in motion the machinery that would ensure she understood the full cost of saving a man's life without permission. That evening, Natalie stood at her late husband's grave in the rain, the grass soft beneath her feet, the headstone wet and dark in the fading light. The rain fell like grace or like judgment, she wasn't sure which anymore. The unit patch was still sewn inside her jacket lining, faded and small, the last physical evidence of a woman who had walked away from everything in order to disappear. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the stone, to the ground, to the man buried beneath it who had loved her before the Pentagon had decided to erase her. "I couldn't protect his commander. I couldn't keep our son's leader safe. I saved him and it doesn't matter because I can't even tell them why I knew how to do what I did. I failed, John. I failed everything I was supposed to protect." The rain fell harder, and she stood in it without moving, without crying, without doing anything except acknowledging that sometimes saving a life meant losing your own. By 6 in the morning, Dr. Hargrove had already made 4 phone calls. The hospital board chairman answered on the second ring, a man named Brennan whose country club membership fee Hargrove had discreetly covered 3 years ago, a favor that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Hargrove's voice was smooth as silk, just the right note of concerned colleague. We have a credentialing issue. The nurse from yesterday's incident, I'm concerned about her background. Her employment history has gaps. I need the board to flag this immediately. Brennan didn't ask questions. He said he'd call the director by 7. The second call went to Sacred Heart Medical Center in Jacksonville, where Natalie had worked for 18 months before moving to Savannah. Hargrove introduced himself as a peer reviewing credentials. I'm trying to verify Nurse Hayes' experience with advanced procedures. Can you confirm her scope of practice? The nursing director hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the framing of the question. Hargrove didn't wait for an answer. I only asked because she performed an invasive procedure yesterday without physician authorization. I'm wondering if this is a pattern. He hung up before the director could process the implication. Third call, a Mercy General in Charleston. Same script. Different voice, slightly more concerned this time, the tone of a superior worried about a colleague's stability. Was Nurse Hayes ever flagged for judgment issues? Anything in her personnel file about unpredictable behavior? By 8 o'clock, her references were poisoned. Not with lies, Hargrove was too intelligent for outright fabrication. Insinuations worked better. Carefully worded questions that planted doubt like seeds. Former supervisors who had liked her would now second-guess that assessment, would remember small incidents that could be reframed as concerning. At 8:15, Hargrove made the 5th call. State Board of Nursing. I need to report a serious credentialing concern. A nurse at Oak Creek Memorial performed a pericardiocentesis, emergency needle decompression for cardiac tamponade, without physician authorization, without the appropriate credentials on file, and without documented training in the procedure. The state investigator's voice sharpened immediately. Credentialing violations were their jurisdiction. Equipment failures were one thing. Incompetent practitioners were another. Hargrove provided her name, her unit, the exact time of the incident. He did not mention that the procedure had saved the patient's life. That detail was irrelevant to his narrative. By 9:30, a state medical investigator named Dr. Patricia Okonkwo was in the hospital's Human Resources office, requesting Natalie's complete personnel file. She was thorough, her manner professional, but her questions sharp as a scalpel. The hospital attorney sat beside her, reviewing the same documents, his expression growing more concerned with each page. Natalie's employment history didn't add up. 7 years at Mercy General, which checked out. 18 months at Sacred Heart, which the director had just called about with vague concerns about judgment. And before that, a gap. A 3-year gap where Natalie apparently didn't exist. No employment history, no address on file, nothing. When the gap ended, she appeared in Jacksonville with a new social security number that was legitimate but bore no prior history. The attorney flagged it immediately. This is unusual. It's as if her record was sealed and restarted. Dr. Okonkwo made a note. That happens sometimes. Witness protection, federal relocation programs, security clearances. But those usually come with documentation. This one just has gaps. And she performed an advanced procedure yesterday, the attorney said quietly. Without authorization, the investigator confirmed. By 10 o'clock, they had brought Natalie into a small conference room off the administrator's office. She was still wearing her scrubs from the night shift, still running on the adrenaline of having held an admiral's life in her hands for 8 hours, still processing that her son was somewhere in this hospital now, that his commander was alive because she had acted. Dr. Okonkwo sat across from her with a folder open. Her expression was not hostile, but it was clinical. Nurse Hayes, I need to ask you about your background. Specifically about this 3-year gap in your employment history from 2016 to 2019. Natalie's hand stayed still. Her jaw didn't clench. I can't discuss that period. Why not? Federal restriction. The investigator's pen paused. Can you provide documentation of that restriction? No. The documentation would compromise the restriction itself. It was the truth, the only truth she could offer. Her records from that period had been sealed by the Pentagon. The extraction operation in Helmand Province, the testimony she'd given against a procurement ring that went all the way to a Navy captain's office, the relocation program that had erased her identity and rebuilt it from scratch, all of it classified. Above the State Board's clearance level. Above Savannah's clearance level. So secret that confirming it existed would expose the very thing it was designed to hide. And regarding yesterday's procedure, Dr. Okonkwo continued, can you explain your training in pericardiocentesis? I can't. You can't explain it, or you won't. Both, Natalie said quietly. The investigator closed the folder. I'll need to speak with your previous employers about your clinical competence. And I'll be filing a formal complaint about scope of practice violations pending the outcome of that investigation. Natalie nodded. She knew what was happening. She could see it coming like a storm surge, Hargrove's network moving, his favors activating, his strategy unfolding with the precision of a man who had planned this the moment she pulled the needle away and began drawing fluid from the Admiral's pericardial sac. By 11:30, the hospital's chief of staff, a woman named Margot Chen who had never spoken more than 3 sentences to Natalie, had been informed that a credentialing investigation was underway. By policy, that meant immediate suspension of clinical privileges pending clearance. By noon, security was waiting at the entrance to the cardiac unit. 2 guards who had never harassed her, who had nodded at her every day for 3 days, now stood with quiet authority and asked her to hand over her badge. Her access credentials. Her parking pass. One of them was genuinely uncomfortable about it, his eyes avoiding hers. We need you to exit the building, he said. Your attorney can handle the details of your suspension. The Admiral, she asked. Not your concern anymore. She wasn't allowed to go back to her locker. Wasn't allowed to collect the photo of John that sat on the shelf beside her name. The faded unit patch that was sewn into the jacket lining remained in that locker, hidden where she'd placed it 3 days ago, a piece of her identity locked away in a hospital that would soon belong to someone else's memory. The guards escorted her through the corridors she had walked for 72 hours, past the faces of nurses who had mocked her and doctors who had ignored her. A few of them watched her go. None of them said anything. The parking lot was brilliant with Savannah sunshine. The humidity hit her like a physical thing, thick, wet, suffocating. She stood beside her car for a long moment before getting in, her hands finally beginning to shake as soon as she was alone, as soon as no one could see them. She drove without purpose, her mind fractured into 1,000 pieces. She had saved the Admiral's life. She had saved her son's commander. And she had lost everything. She had violated her witness protection agreement by using her training, by revealing through action what her background contained. The Pentagon would know by now. They would have been notified the moment the State Board contacted federal clearance offices looking for documentation. The rain began as she crossed into Bonaventure Cemetery, the Spanish moss hanging from the live oaks like ghosts, everything grey and silver and dissolving into water. She found his grave without thinking, her feet knowing the way they had walked 1,000 times before. John Edward Hayes. 1978 to 2017. Beloved husband. Navy SEAL. The rain fell in sheets now, soaking through her scrubs, plastering her hair to her face. She knelt in the mud without caring about the stain, without thinking about propriety or dignity or any of the things she had been taught to guard so carefully. I failed, she whispered to the stone, to the man buried beneath it, to the version of herself that had believed she could be a nurse and a mother and a ghost all at the same time. I failed, John. I couldn't save his commander properly. I couldn't keep my son safe by staying invisible. I can't even tell anyone why. Her fingers traced his name, worn smooth by countless previous visits. The rain washed the mud from her hands, washed the hospital smell from her clothes, washed away everything except the terrible, crushing knowledge that she had done exactly what she swore she wouldn't do. She had let someone matter more than her survival. And in doing so, she had ended it all. The rotor wash hit the hospital lobby like a physical force. Dr. Hargrove stood before 3 news cameras on the 4th day, mid-sentence about maintaining standards, when the fluorescent lights flickered and the plate glass doors rattled against their frames. His voice faltered. The cameras swung toward the sound. Through the windows, the tail boom of a Navy helicopter rose above the parking lot, and 3 minutes later, the front doors burst open. The rain that had been threatening all morning finally came, sheets of it, driven sideways by the wind, and with it came 7 naval officers in dress whites, their movement precise and purposeful as a tactical formation. Hargrove's face went the color of aged parchment. He wasn't finished talking. Nobody had dismissed him. But the cameras had stopped listening. They were filming the officers now, their insignia catching the flash photography. A 2-star Admiral star caught the light like a promise of judgment. The lead investigator, a woman with iron-gray hair and the bearing of someone who had signed off on classified documents, stepped forward, her file trembling slightly in her hands. She wasn't trembling from fear. She was trembling from barely contained fury. Behind her came Natalie, flanked by 2 naval officers, their escort neither aggressive nor deferential. Just inevitable. The elevator doors slid open on the 4th floor, and they moved toward room for 47 in silence. The Admiral's eyes had been closed for 3 days. The machines around his bed wheezed their monotonous rhythm, ventilator, heart monitor, the rhythmic squeeze of the blood pressure cuff. His eyes opened as Natalie stepped through the doorway. Shadows and fluorescent light cast her face in 2 tones, half angel, half something else entirely. His lips moved, and from the throat of a man who shouldn't have been able to speak came a single word, barely a whisper, phantom. Natalie's son stepped forward. He wore his dress whites with the careful precision of someone who had practiced the moment in a mirror. His voice when he spoke was steady, but it broke on the 3rd word. Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. The room seemed to contract. The machines continued their beeping and hissing. The heart monitor trace spiked, the Admiral's vitals responding to recognition, to the return of someone he had commanded, someone he had believed was dead or disappeared. The lead investigator opened her file. Her voice was military-grade calm. 3 tours, Helmand Province, 2016 through 2019. Naval Special Warfare Support Designation. Unit Attachment, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, under your command, sir. She turned the first page. 47 field trauma operations documented. 0 surgical mortality rate in combat conditions. The Admiral's hand moved across the sheets. He was trying to reach Natalie. Her son reached out instead, and the Admiral's grip tightened. For a moment, 2 generations of a military family held each other in a hospital room for stories above Savannah. A SEAL team leader in full dress uniform stepped forward. The rubber soles of his boots squeaked against the polished hospital floor, a sound like resistance, like something refusing to slide. He held a 241-page document that had been classified at the highest levels. His voice was the voice of someone who had trained to give orders in firefights, and it carried down the hallway without raising, Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. 2 purple hearts. 3 meritorious unit commendations. Senior Chief Hayes ran trauma operations for DivGru under direct fire in Sanjan Valley, Loga Province, and northern Helmand. She pulled 16 wounded operators out of a compromised position while the opposition was active. He paused. He looked directly at Natalie. You were listed as KIA in 2019. Your unit held a memorial service. The Admiral's eyes filled with water. A 2-star Admiral, commander of the entire carrier strike group, was crying silently as he gripped his subordinate's son's hand. The FBI agent's voice cut through like a knife through the tissue of lies and corruption that had wrapped around Oak Creek Memorial for 14 months. She stood in the doorway with 3 federal agents behind her, their badges catching the light from room for 47. Senior Chief Hayes was ordered into witness protection in October 2019 following her testimony regarding a procurement corruption ring operating between the Pentagon and 6 private military contractors. Her service record was classified. Her identity was sealed. Her location was protected under federal statute. She looked at Hargrove, who had followed the procession upstairs, who stood at the threshold of room 47 watching his career disintegrate in real time. You attempted to force a federally protected witness out of employment without knowing her classification level or her legal status. That's not just grounds for termination. That's federal obstruction. Hargrove's mouth opened. No sound emerged. His carefully constructed network, the hospital board chairman who owed him favors, the state investigators he'd contacted, the credibility concerns he'd planted, none of it mattered anymore. The moment a two-star admiral said "Phantom" out loud, the game was over. The two-star admiral stood, his uniform immaculate, his movements controlled by decades of command authority. He walked toward Hargrove with the deliberate pace of someone who had made decisions that cost lives and was prepared to make another. His hand rose. It was not a gesture of violence. It was worse than violence. It was a gesture of erasure. His fingers closed on Hargrove's hospital credentials, the badge, the lanyard, the photograph of a man who had believed himself untouchable. He tore it from Hargrove's neck in a single motion, and the lanyard left a thin red line where it had pressed against his skin. "Dr. Hargrove, your privileges at this facility are terminated immediately, effective this moment." The Admiral's voice didn't rise. Military authority doesn't need volume. Senior Chief Hayes saved the life of Rear Admiral Morrison while 5 doctors refused to act. He turned to face the staff that had gathered in the hallway, nurses, residents, attendings, custodial staff, patients leaning out of doorways. 5 doctors. 14 minutes. 1 nurse with courage. He looked at Hargrove. "You are finished here." The FBI agents moved with practiced efficiency. "Dr. Marcus Hargrove, you're under arrest for healthcare fraud, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, and acceptance of illegal kickbacks from medical supply contractors." They read his rights with the monotonous perfection of a recitation performed 1,000 times. The plastic zip ties closed around his wrists with a sharp click. They led him past the gathered staff, past Chen and Rodriguez and Pembroke and Khalil, the 5 doctors who had stood paralyzed while a nurse performed the procedure that saved the Admiral's life. None of them looked at Hargrove as he passed. Their faces had the blank expression of people who had survived the day and were learning to accept what that meant. The hospital CEO appeared, flanked by attorneys, having reviewed the documents in a frantic 30-minute emergency meeting that morning. She looked at Natalie with an expression that balanced apology against legal liability. "We were deceived," she said quietly. Natalie didn't respond. She was looking at the Admiral, who was looking at her son, who was looking at his mother as if seeing her for the first time in 4 years. The cameras outside continued recording. Dr. Hargrove's destruction was being broadcast live on 3 Savannah news stations. His medical license would be suspended within 48 hours. His colleagues would claim they barely knew him. His network would evaporate like rain on hot asphalt. 6 months later, someone spotted Dr. Marcus Hargrove in a strip mall classroom in northern Georgia, teaching CPR certification courses to high school students. His voice had lost its surgical precision. He explained compressions and rescue breathing to teenagers who had no idea they were learning from a disgraced physician. The money was minimum wage. No hospital would touch him. No practice would hire him. His name had become synonymous with corruption in medical circles. He had been subpoenaed 3 times and would be subpoenaed 3 more before the case finally closed. The billing fraud had been tracked to 247 false charges totaling $847,000 in inflated post-operative care. The kickbacks from the medical supply company had been documented through text messages, wire transfers, and recorded phone calls. He had tried to destroy evidence. Federal agents had recovered it from his home computer in encrypted folders labeled investment portfolio. The fall had been total. Complete. Absolute. At Oak Creek Memorial, the main atrium filled with ceremony. Flags hung from the railings, the American flag, the Navy flag, the Admiral's personal command flag. Natalie stood in her senior chief petty officer dress uniform for the first time in 4 years. The Navy cross hung on her chest. The 2 silver stars caught the light like promises kept. Her son stood beside her in his dress whites, promoted to lieutenant junior grade, his face reflecting a pride so deep it looked like it might break him. The Admiral, Rear Admiral Morrison, fully recovered, moving without the weight of a failing heart, stepped forward and pinned a commendation medal on her son's uniform. The flash photography erupted. The gathered staff applauded. Natalie's son looked at his mother, and something private passed between them. The kind of moment that doesn't need words. The kind of moment that needs silence and the presence of people who understand that some secrets protect more people than the truth. Afterward, in a quiet hallway on the 3rd floor, Natalie walked to her old locker. Someone had kept her belongings. Her jacket hung there, the one she'd worn during night shifts, the one that still smelled faintly of antiseptic and rain. She pulled it down and felt the lining. The unit patch from Helmand Province was still there, sewn carefully against the fabric where it had hidden for 4 years of silence and witness protection and fear. The needle and thread had held through everything, the investigations, the termination, the rain at her husband's grave, the months of uncertainty. She took a small knife from the locker, the kind trauma nurses carry for cutting away bandages and dressings, and carefully cut the threads. The patch came free. It was faded from 4 years of darkness. The colors had dulled. But the design was unmistakable, the unit insignia of the SEAL Team 3 Charlie Platoon, Helmand Province, 2016 to 2019. She pinned it to her uniform jacket, next to the Navy Cross. For the first time in 4 years, it was no longer contraband. No longer secret. No longer something that could destroy her or the man whose life she had saved. Her son appeared in the hallway. "Why did you stay hidden, Mom?" Natalie looked at the patch on her jacket, at the light from the hospital windows catching the medal ribbons. "Because some secrets protect more people than the truth," she said. "But some truths are worth the cost." The Admiral approached. He shook her hand with the grip of someone who had commanded men into impossible situations and survived when others didn't. He looked at the gathered staff, the nurses who had watched her work those first 3 days, the residents who had seen her perform that emergency pericardiocentesis, the attendants who had heard her dismiss Hargrove's cruelty with a single quiet sentence. "True class," the Admiral said, his voice carrying, "is what you do when the lights go out." Natalie thought of room for 47 at 2 a.m. She thought of 5 doctors walking away. She thought of hands that had stopped shaking when duty called. She thought of a unit patch hidden in a jacket lining for 4 years, finally worn in the light. If you've been with us before, welcome back, hit that like button. If you're new, we're glad you're here, please subscribe. Either way, leave a comment and say hello.